Okay, so we come now to the final topic here in chapter 23, and that is the idea of capitalism, as well as a little bit with the scientific revolution. So we've talked about the societal changes of religion, we've talked about how that affects politics and how politics can affect some societal and economic changes, but now we're predominantly looking at this piece that also will play into the idea of the changes that are affecting the other parts of the globe at this point when we talk about exploration, colonialization, things within that nature. All right, so that's what we're going to kind of talk here is first off the definition of capitalism. So the idea that individuals and private businesses can invest money and spend it, and how they buy, trade, sell goods and services. So if I want to get the new AirPods, I'm going to spend money for that at the value that they're expected to cost. All right, and companies and people organize that money out as they wish. All right, so this connects to the idea of private ownership of land, private ownership of property, businesses, profit, machines, tools, competition, all that stuff, and there's limited government interference. So we've kind of already alluded to this a little bit with the Dutch and the British with their trading post companies, their joint stock companies, the trading post empires that are independently run by essentially corporations and not by government entities like you see with the Dutch or with the Spanish. So those are very different things in terms of, again, that idea of absolutism versus constitutional governments versus, or within the context of, where is there going to be more profit and investment? Is it going to come from private entities, or is it going to come from within the Spanish and the Dutch, or sorry, the Spanish and the Portuguese by government run and supported programs versus independently owned and controlled organizations and corporations that are trying to make as much money as possible? So with the Dutch and the British, they are more inclined to essentially let the Dutch and British joint stock companies, the independently run ones or privately run ones, make as much money as possible because then they make money off of trading and taxes and things of that nature. All right. So within the idea of capitalism is you create and make what you want to make, and you determine who you want to buy with. Sometimes you determine who you want to trade with. Sometimes the government decides that for you, with the ideas of tariffs on foreign countries, things of that nature, and essentially the number of competitors are going to dictate the prices and the quantity. So, I always use a cell phone analogy. All right. So I'm going to pull out, my iPhone. I don't remember if it's a 6, 7, or 8 at this point. People can probably tell by looking at it, what this comes out to. And so, if I invent a smartphone, okay, and I'm the only one that has access to this technology, and it has internet, it has texting, it can stream videos, listen to music, all that nature, as well as make phone calls, which is the purpose of a phone, at least initially, all right, then I can dominate that market and I can sell it for whatever I want, no matter what it costs. But the more competitors I have, okay, the more people that can essentially duplicate what I do, stimulus diffusion, make it a little bit different, maybe make it cheaper, that can run me out of business if I don't learn to compete. But if I'm the only person or group that can do that, then I'm doing pretty good. So when the Dutch East India Company and the British East India Company come along and decide that, hey, we can get faster ships, we can get more ships, we can get more merchants out there, make more contacts than a government can, then we're going to, make more money at better prices and make better deals. Hence why other people are trying to get in on this to make more money. All right. So, and this is nothing new. Capitalism is something that's been essentially occurring since man learned to, essentially sit down and plant crops and make trades. Now it's just in pursuit of as much money as possible or as many goods as we can, trade and market amongst one another. All right. So this is supported by banks, with the idea of, again, credit, holding on to your money, giving out loans. So again, not just on hard cash either, but the idea that, okay, we trust them. There's the value of the goods that they're going to bring back that we can then exchange for cash and other things. All right. So that's just kind of the background of that. So the capitalist policies and economic expansion that help follow the bubonic plague are aided, or that the fact that these things aid capitalism in a number of ways. Okay, again, continuity, population growth and urbanization. All right, so this is, again, following the bubonic plague, but now we also can tie this into the Columbian exchange from the Americas within the idea of the new crops that are now stabilizing food supplies within the idea of the potato. The potato, well, it has a lot of good carbohydrates and it's a lot more sturdier than just bread, all right, because it's got a lot more in it than just like an actual loaf of bread in terms of being able to support it. So it helps to stimulate the diets as well as improving them, getting a more diversification in there, and more stable food supply that we can now take from other parts of the globe and plant them in other parts as well to, again, diversify and then increase and improve our health and diets overall. All right, which also plays in with urbanization and less people needing to be out in the countryside. Joint stock companies, as we've alluded to already so far in this video. All right. So the idea is, again, helping push capitalism within these joint stock companies and the colonies that are needing products, pushing for international trade. So again, those colonies are going to need manufactured products to help support themselves because most of the manufacturing is being done in Europe. And that's also quite intentional. So the colonies within, parts of the areas dominated by Spain, Portugal, the French, the British, and the Dutch, and the Americas, they're essentially saying, you're going to give us the product, we're going to bring it back to Europe, and then sell it back to you. That's the triangular trade, or part of it. The other part, obviously, is slavery coming out of West Africa and some goods coming out of West Africa. But that's kind of what's being exchanged on this level, is the idea of, we're going to take the goods from the Americas, turn it into, finished manufactured products here in, so again, the idea of taking, sugarcane, turning it into something, making it into something else in Europe, bringing it back across the sea to then sell as a finished product is how the Europeans are also making a lot more money. This also helps with the idea of the fact that because of the increase in the discovery of silver and gold, as we've mentioned, particularly, again, the silver mines in Potosi and Zacatecas, as well as Japan, is increasing the flow of capital, increasing the flow of valuable commodities that people can then trade with instead of just other types of currency. This is something hard that people, when I mean hard, I mean like an actual hard currency, not paper or credit that people are willing to exchange for. So that makes it a lot easier to borrow too when they have that, stacks and stacks of gold and silver to essentially value their currency. And again, if you want more explanations on economics, don't come to me. I'm not a great expert on how economics works like this. Ms. Zangs is excellent at this information, so she would be a very good contact for it. Or if you know somebody who's good at accounting or banking or finance, this would be something more up their alley. Right? Other things. Again, as we've alluded to, governments who make more money off of taxes in exchange for giving them essentially a lot of the freedom. So we talked about the British and the Dutch being essentially allowed to control their own trading post empires without oversight of the government or without oversight of their governments. This connects back to it because the governments are like, well, we can just tax them off of all the profits that they're making, and that's going to be just as fine instead of using government treasury money to fund exploration, fund these ships, fund protections for the sailors. Let the private organizations do that. They're willing to fund it. And the more profits they make, the more money we can make on taxes instead of us continually investing and maybe risking taxpayer money on this. So that's why these two countries in particular are willing to allow this to occur. Also, there's the improvement of roads within Europe that make it a lot easier to transport goods and services, reducing internal tariffs within a country instead of between counties. So that's occurring within France. And the idea of state-run manufacturing. So this is, again, the idea of Russia, of France, within Spain, producing stuff and then selling it under the government control versus, the independent stuff going on in Great Britain and the Dutch, right, within the Netherlands. So they also, and this ties back into, again, that promotion of those finished products, is to sell those things back to those other colonies and other countries, and also attempt to essentially limit imports. So the countries want to be self-sufficient at what they're producing, as well as making sure that they can produce enough food for themselves and their own manufactured goods so that people don't want to buy Dutch goods. They want to stay and buy British goods if they're living in Great Britain, and vice versa. If you're Dutch, you want to be like, well, we only want to buy stuff that is brought to us by the Dutch and not the British. So they essentially try to limit that as well as produce things for themselves to keep as much money as possible within their own lands, right? As well as forcing their colonies, and this is that we refer back to in in U.S. history, that the British colonies, i.e. the 13 colonies here in America, were not able to trade with the French or the Dutch or the Spanish. They were outlawed by the British. So essentially, they gave unfinished products to the British or the resources to the British. British would then turn around, make something in Great Britain, and sell it back to them at a higher price in the colonies. And the colonists didn't have a legal ability to kind of challenge that authority or to trade with anybody that they wanted to. Because the British said, you're British subjects, you have to trade with British merchants and British manufacturing. So that's the idea of mercantilism, is to, again, can make more of that stuff and make more money off your colonies than your colonies can make off of other people. So again, this relies on having a lot of good services and strong services and businesses to support the economy as a whole, instead of, again, becoming really, really good at just one thing, as we talked about within, China, essentially focusing on, limited parts within their own economy, because you have to be really, really good in order for mercantilism to actually work, right? And then also, there's also the softer views from the church on the idea of profits and interest. So again, tying back into the idea of usury, because even though religion is a societal good, and they begin to push that religion, or that I shouldn't say, not religion is a societal good. Of course, religion believes that, but the idea that interest, making money, is a good thing for society and for individuals, in spite of the fact that some people might become more selfish. There's more social divisions, but this stuff is well worth it. All right, so the view of being poor becomes part of a moral failure instead of a societal failure, and that's kind of a shift in the thinking. That's kind of a negative outcome. All right, so this also ties itself into the putting out or cottage system, they're interchangeable terms, to replace the guilds. So guilds, again, being essentially, the first version of a trade union, where they essentially set the price, they set the quality of the product, the amount in production, and, you're training somebody in, and then, they're going to take over or start their own firm, and it's going to be, a good support system for these manual laborers. However, the putting out and cottage system replaces that, because businesses will drop off their materials, so like the Dutch East India Company, or, enter name here, drops off at a cottage in the countryside or rural areas, who will then create a finished product with that. So if they're bringing over, cotton, they will bring it over to Great Britain, and, housing will, make clothing out of it. They will, use this stuff, and then we'll, again, make finished cloth. So again, here's cotton, the merchant cottages, they'll make finished cloth and resell it to towns and to other locations, back to the colonies, whatever, because it's cheaper than the guilds, and the fact that people in these rural areas need the money, so they're not going to say no. So all produced in-house, hence in the cottage, is essentially where this is made, by families who specialize in one type of production. So this rises also that standard of living of the Western European peasants and artisans, who are making more unique things, more unique commodities than those in Eastern Europe. Again, think the serfs or other people in Russia and other parts of Eastern Europe, 5 times as much. So their standard of living continues to increase as a result of this manufacturing that they can do in-house, as a result of, the shift, which also weakens the ability of the guilds, right? Because, the guilds had set wages, they had set prices, quality standards, and it pretty much essentially tried to discourage outside competition that weren't the guilds, because that offset their ability to make money. This also means that more luxury goods and items are now more available, or more readily available, because you have more people producing them. So wine, cheese, wool, cotton, clothing, all that stuff becomes more available. And so that, again, kind of raises the standard. Things that were considered more lavish and expensive, while still there, become more mainstream, i.e. wine and cheese now being available to more of the masses, if on a larger scale. All right. So last thing we're going to mention here very briefly, the scientific revolution. And while this is very massive and major, for the prospects of what we talk about here in AP World, the long-term consequences are more important than the actual, the shift in the universe, or the view of the universe, instead of being, the Earth is the center. Nope, it's the sun, at least in the solar system. The idea of ellipses and the movement of the orbits. While that's important, and the ideas of, physics and gravity, that stuff isn't something you're going to have to be tested on. It's just, again, the thought process of things changing. So again, that kind of plays in with the idea of humanism, of understanding the world in a more scientific fashion at this point, following more empirical evidence, trial and error, the scientific method, hypotheses, things like that are working instead to do that. And at the same time, it also, in a sense, weakens the power of the church, because it goes against what church doctrine had actually said. Hence why guys like Galileo were excommunicated for a time. Same thing with Newton. And they said, yeah, you're not Christian because it goes against our belief systems, which was not the intent. But again, it was challenging normal standards and seeing it in a more scientific world. And how do we look at evidence and make determinations? It's through evidence and reasoning, which is, again, connected back towards the idea of the Renaissance and added in here, which will then be applied to social issues later on when we talk about the Enlightenment, when we get to the revolutions. So that's where we wrap up with chapter 23.